Amber. Thank you for joining us for today's Spark webinar, looking at the redesigned SAT domains and dimensions. I'm joined here with Jeannie Oliver and Sarah Hanna, who will be presenting today. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Amber.
And so, once again, if you're joining us, just want to let you know that we would love to hear your questions as we go. In order to do that, you'll want to use the chat area, so there's a little cartoon bubble. Click on that and send us your questions as we go, and I'll be happy to pass those along to Jeannie and Sarah as they present today. So we're going to be looking at the recent shifts in the SAT and the new frameworks that have been released by the College Board to really guide how schools prepare students for those. And now these frameworks are being used in an interesting way. Jeannie or Sarah, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Amber. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you today. We're just wanting to talk a little bit about some of the key changes that we've seen with the SAT redesign and how this affects you in your teaching and learning in the classroom as you're building your curriculum maps and as you're aligning your curriculum to the new SAT framework. As you know, the SAT was redesigned in 2015, just to give a little bit of backstory, and then the first actual assessments came out in spring of last year, in 2016. So we're about 1 year into the redesign and thought it might be nice to see how schools have integrated the redesign into their classroom and take a closer look at that as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that the redesign contains and some of the key elements that were part of that, the thinking behind it. Just to give a little bit more context, from what we've been hearing was that the College Board was really hoping to kind of refocus the direction and intention behind the SAT. So what they were finding was that even if students were experiencing success in their SAT performance, it didn't necessarily equate to post-secondary success. So they were wanting to marry the two a bit more closely and wanting to help propel students to whatever their opportunities will be after graduation, whether it's college, career, their life after school. So that leads to just us talking a little bit about some of the key changes that we've seen. So if you can look on your screen here, we have just a couple of them described here, that there's a stronger command and deeper understanding for fewer topics. So there's actually less questions, and so students can spend more time on each question. And then there's also a greater learning and less cramming. So the idea of instead of having like a wide breadth of topics, that there's going to be a little bit less breadth and then greater depth with each of those questions.
Which goes right along with the redesign of the Common Core standards, or the redesign of English language arts standards for those states that have adopted that, correct?
Exactly, yep, and that's a really good point. So kind of mirroring that other educational shift that the Common Core started several years before, and wanting to align the experience that students have with the SAT, kind of following that similar format.
Right. And so what we've been finding, and the reason why we wanted to put this together for those online, is because often the schools we work with are wondering, when do we start that to help the students be successful with those types of questions that they're going to be receiving on the SAT, especially with the states that have adopted the SAT as the formal exam, correct?
Right, exactly. At this point, there's 6 states who have adopted the SAT redesign into their curriculum instruction. So these changes will be really important as you're thinking about how you're going to structure your time in your classroom. Which actually brings us nicely to the next bullet point, which is that the assessments are hoping to align more closely to actually what's happening in your classroom. So the type of formative tasks and experiences that your students are getting already, that will more closely mirror the way that they see the questions framed on the exam.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the whole phrase of we're not teaching to the exam is not what we're saying here. It's that the SAT should be already part of the learning process occurring when the teachers are aligned with the standards.
Exactly.
So we're bringing together the Common Core, we're bringing together what teachers are already doing to really prepare students. Is that right?
Right.
Awesome.
And taking away that element of, oh yeah, I also have to make sure my students are prepared for the SATs, but that it's more closely aligned to what they're already doing, what they're already experiencing.
As long as the teachers take the time to unpack the various different concepts and skills within each of those standards.
Exactly. To take a closer look at how the standards that they're accountable to at their school already mirror those with the redesigned SAT framework.
Right.
So continue a bit further, a few other changes, looking at problems and questions more in a real-world context. So, you know, that could be with, you know, incorporating some founding documents from social studies and history, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, or it could be through questions that are part of kind of a larger social context. So really giving students that real-world experience rather than looking at a context or looking at a word or a phrase in isolation, seeing that it actually gains meaning in the context that it's being used. So
what I would take away from that and what we've been hearing schools do too is this is not just an ELA thing.
Exactly, right. Yes, the ELA and math are the key pieces, but they're also being looked at in a context of science and history and social studies as well.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, so how are the ingredients of the standards at your school similar or different to the SAT domain ingredients? So if we're thinking about the standards with which we align to as a set of ingredients, and we have all this choice in front of us, to see how similar or different are these? How much overlap is there to what we're seeing already? So if we take a look here at a side-by-side comparison from the reading strand, you see on the left side of the page we have the Common Core reading, and it's a literature strand, and in conjunction with the SAT domain, the reading domain. And as you'll take time to look these over more closely even after our conversation, you'll see that there is quite a bit of crossover between the close reading sections, for example, and talking about what the text is saying both explicitly and implicitly and drawing meaning from those areas, making inferences. We see reasonable inferences, logical inferences, analyzing text structure, looking at text structure and word choice. We also see the analyzation of supporting claims represented in both the SAT domains and the Common Core. And these continue a little bit further down on the page on the SAT side as well. So there really is a fair amount of crossover. So hopefully seeing that, you don't immediately feel overwhelmed that, oh gosh, are these completely different? How am I going to align my curriculum to both?
You know, Sarah, I'm really glad that you're pointing this out, because a lot of the schools, they have their teachers pull this report up. For those online that are using Atlas, this is a report that you can generate within the system, and we'd be happy to connect with you, to share with you offline. Email us, and we'll get back to you on how to generate this. But what a great conversational piece, right? To just first have your teacher sit down and say comparison. Let's walk through and do a crosswalk, right?
Exactly. And to be able to run a standards alignment report like this, we can see that for this particular school system, they are currently aligning to the Common Core, and they've added the SAT domains to their system, but they haven't done those alignments yet. But running this report allows them to see what standards they've targeted and the assessments that they've built around those standards, and it will also help them as they're moving forward in those SAT alignments.
Absolutely. I would also imagine that would allow them to see, as they do the crosswalk, the comparison between the two, how they could say that this one domain is being connected to multiple units of instruction throughout the whole school year, and how in depth are they going. So.
Yeah. So it really comes down to asking the right questions, so wanting to see how can we support that skill development in the classroom and helping students succeed in the classroom and beyond. So if we're gonna take a look at this in this little graphic here, we're really thinking about ultimately the learning that endures. So if we look at the different pieces that are part of learning success, we see both on the more immediate side, the classroom experience, so students achieving and being able to succeed for the next task and the next assignment within the classroom, but then panning back a little bit larger, looking at the other state exams and the SAT, preparing them for success on those, but then also their college and career life, their life beyond the exams. So rather than, I think that the College Board is really trying to shift their focus, so it's not just about, hey, here's how to prepare your students for the SAT.
Right.
But how are teachers already trying to prepare your students for success in college and career and life beyond, and then working backwards, so then how do we align the SAT to that experience?
Well, it's really nice that, that these organizations did have this conversation of saying, let's take a look at these standards across the whole country.
Exactly.
And since the majority of the states did decide on adopting or aligning to the Common Core, I would imagine that that's what, the SAT board got together prior to that, right?
Yeah.
And started having this epiphany of saying, don't put more on the teacher or more on the student to know this.
Right.
But rather, let's see the skill set and how deep they can go. So that makes sense.
Yeah, if we have a different set of requirements or expectations for them, that's not going to set them up as much for success. So, yeah, it was an important conversation for them to have. So let's take a look briefly at the domains, which there are 7 domains, which are like kind of the overarching strands that comprise the redesigned SAT framework. So we have reading, writing, and essay as part of the kind of ELA components. And then within math, we have the Hearts of Algebra domain, problem solving and data analysis, Passport to Advanced Math, and then just kind of an additional topics category. But Jeannie, as you mentioned earlier on, that these aren't just happening in a funnel of ELA or within math, but under a context of other subject areas. So they're going to be questions that would fall into a science category or a history category, so that that knowledge and applicability is really happening beyond those 2 content areas.
More so even with those schools and states that have moved to next generation science standards, because a lot of those inquiry-based skill sets for next gen, they're going to be asking students to model or write their thought process. So I can see the easy connection there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point about the NGSS. So we just wanted to also show you how this looks in Atlas. So if your school may have already added the SAT domains to your Atlas system, and if you haven't, then that's something that you can communicate with us, and we can easily make that available for you in your standards dropdown. So just to walk through kind of the key components to the SAT redesigns, the domains are the strands, so those 7 that we just mentioned before, and then the dimensions are these bolded content here. They're kind of the content markers, the key topics that students are expected to know, so linear equations, linear functions, and such. And then the descriptions are the content underneath that are kind of written as skill statements, so describing what students should know and be able to do. So that is a math example, and then similarly, this is how it would look in ELA, and this is the reading domain.
But do you think that for some schools or teachers, as they're aligning their curriculum not only to their state tests, or sorry, their expectations, their standards, and they're doing a comparison from their standards to the SAT domains, could they use the dimensions in their skills category for some of their unit template designs?
Yeah, absolutely. That could be a great place to build. Absolutely, great idea. So it really comes down to, they're not asking teachers to reinvent the wheel, just realign it. I know, exactly. That's all they need. Got got a very full plate already, so I like that quote, and I think that kind of explains it well. So, Jeannie, maybe we should take a look at some of the examples that we've seen in Atlas about how schools are building those alignments and the different looks that we can glean from how they're adding the domains in Atlas.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect segue because, as we were just saying, you're not supposed to reinvent the wheel, right? So oftentimes when something gets updated, we get the question, oh, these standards got updated, or this new exam is coming out. How can we not really add too much to what we've already been doing, right? So some of these schools that we've been working with have had a conversation with us as well as their curriculum team, and we highly recommend having conversations with your already existing curriculum teams or your teachers and say, what makes sense for us to incorporate this layer of deeper analysis of our curriculum, right? So this is one school in Illinois. They decided that within their content standards to add those domains and dimensions there because it just makes sense.
Now, isn't Illinois one of the 6 states that has adopted the SAT? Okay.
It is. And they were very fast adopters, by the way. So
it'll be interesting to see if other states follow suit, too, in the SAT adoption.
Absolutely. It's so true. So earlier I was mentioning how you could take the dimensions of the domains and add them into your skills category box. So here you could see somewhat of that incorporation from the SAT domains in their content standards. They've added it or incorporated into their knowledge and skills category box. Now, not all the schools have that available on their template, and you can definitely add that. Just go ahead and contact us. But another thing that a school has decided to do is they wanted front and center. In other words, they wanted to separate it so that when teachers go in to design their unit in their lesson plans, that they have specific category for their areas. So this is a high school, and they designed the template where they wanted the SAT up on top next to what they call their power skills, so that way as they're aligning to their power skills, they're also looking to say, okay, of those power skills, these specific dimensions and domains are part of it. And then you could see that they unpack into the other areas, so the benchmark skills, which are their standards, and then they even move down into the assessment pieces next. So again, another approach. Every school has a different conversation wrapped around this.
Absolutely.
So this seems to be one of the trends happening more and more in schools that we see across the country is they look through, earlier we were just talking about how take a look at your ELA standards and then compare them to the SAT domains and dimensions, well, mainly the domains. So this school said, we'd like to do that and we'd like them to become our anchor standards when we find a connection. So here they have a P, which represents power, is their language there at that school. So when teachers are aligning to their standards, they see a P, that means it's an anchor standard, and that is a standard that the skill set is a dimension of the SAT.
I really like how that's going to really help create congruency among all the teachers. So we've agreed, we've decided these are the anchor standards versus I have mine that I consider anchor, you have yours. They may or may not be all the same. So that's great that they've taken that step.
So true. Plus, you know, that conversation of, I know Common Core has slimmed down and we've gone deeper, a mile deeper, right, versus a mile wide. But still, realistically, are we going to be hitting all those standards for each of the grade levels per subject area? So, and how in-depth are we going to do that?
Some are definitely more central and some are more peripheral. So I think, getting on the same page on that is really key.
Absolutely. So that same school that identified their power standards, what they did is they did a similar thing that we saw in the template. They pulled out the SAT domains and dimensions and put it to the right.
I see.
So here, this example here, you can just see capacities of literate individuals. but below there is the standards, and I'll jump over to their Atlas system here in a moment. But over to the right-hand side, it allows those teachers to have it right across from each other. In other words, doing another analysis. So let me jump into that Atlas system. Just bear with us.
So that was a template change that they made.
It is.
Okay.
Yes. And this was just recent, so they're still working on things and still, you know, curriculum's always evolving.
It is. It's never done. It's always living and breathing and changing.
Right. It's so true. So as they've done the analysis piece here, they brought in those SAT domains, which it's an easy just check in and then it populates it. We can get into those different dimensions or domains here. So if in ELA, if we were to pull in some math, we could technically do that if we wanted to.
Right.
So here they aligned to those, but as they did that, I'm going to scroll down here. You can see there's a lot of connections between their already existing alignment to the SAT. So it was just one additional step, but the teachers already knew about it.
Right.
So now as I scroll down,
it didn't stray them far off the path from where they were already going.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, their template's set up a little differently. They do have those essential questions. Down below here, as they're building on their curriculum, they have a spot for key concepts and vocabulary. So here is where I want to point out is when they have those key concepts and vocabulary, this is where it ties back to the SAT domains and dimensions.
I see.
This is where they're actually going deeper to pull out saying this is that dimension that's part of the domain and that alignment piece there.
Well, what's interesting, so, you know, especially as a high school English teacher, you have to focus so much on the standards and what if you're doing IB, you know, there's so many things you're focusing on to prepare your students, and you absolutely want to prepare them for the SAT. But to find a way that that can seamlessly become a part of what you're doing rather than an additional thing you have to go to is really important. And this is, to me, this makes a lot of sense in how this can just make what you teach in your curriculum more robust and give you another way to check in that you're, you know, covering and including all the many things you need to include.
Exactly.
Especially for English language arts.
Right.
Ooh, what a beast.
Right.
To really just drill in and see it.
Yeah.
Clear as day. So, you know, there's just those multiple different layers there and different approaches. So if we just really recommend to have the conversation first on what makes sense to incorporate it.
Right. There's so many different ways it could be done. What's going to make the most sense at your school?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Again, you don't want to reinvent the wheel.
Right? Absolutely. In fact, honestly, that should be a mantra as schools are rolling this out to teachers. That should be the mantra. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're just going to realign it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
A mantra that also connects to what's going to inform us, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that's the multi-million-dollar question. Why are we doing this?
Yes. Yes. Well, I was talking to a teacher, and she was like, sometimes it feels like we're just trying to make more work. And I love that as a measure of, is this making more work, or is this guiding what we do?
Exactly.
And so if you can say it's guiding what we do, awesome, we're all in.
Right.
If it's making more work, let's consider what we're doing. But this is, as you're presenting this, it makes a lot of sense to guide what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great yardstick way to measure it. So be thinking about how will you integrate the SAT domains and dimensions at your school. If you have a question or a thought about how you see this applying within your school and your curriculum context, we'd love to hear. So feel free in that chat section if you have a question or if you have a thought about how you see that integration happening. We'd love to hear it, and we'll kind of keep checking back in too as we go through kind of our subsequent explanations. So feel free to add any thoughts or insights you might have in how you see it happening. So while you're thinking about that or writing that, we also want to talk a little bit about next steps. So once you've seen the changes and kind of have an understanding, where do we go from here? So if you haven't spent much time already, even after this conversation, familiarizing yourself a bit more deeply with the SAT redesign, comparing, as we have done, the sets of standards that you're accountable to at your school with those dimensions and descriptions that are part of the redesign. And as Jeannie was saying, looking, kind of highlighting now, where is there crossover here for building a crosswalk that hopefully that it will closely align to the work that you're already doing, right, and that it will feel less like an extra thing, but more of an integrated thing.
Right. And sorry, I want to piggyback on that. You know, working with teachers, if they just are asked to enter information into whatever management system you have for your curriculum, sometimes it can get
arduous,
right. So, redundant, and loss of purpose, right?
Yeah.
So taking a moment to pause to have conversation about this information, teachers welcome it. They might not welcome it at that time because they might have 10,000 things on their plate, but overall, the reason why you go through the process of alignment is to have conversation, right?
Right. And to dig slightly deeper at that comparison and contrasting element, so a variety of different ways that you could go about this, but one way would be you select a content area and you dive into one of those strands, so one of those domains, and compare the strand that you're looking at. So if it's a literature strand with the reading and literature reading strand SAT domain, and see what are those similarities and differences. And then a key piece beyond that is to look and have a vertical conversation with colleagues. The vertical articulation piece is really important. We've actually had some good conversations around that point specifically about when do these fall into play. And I think that we're interested in your feedback too, but I think we're really talking about as early as 8th grade is when students are getting a lot of these concepts and they're building these knowledge and skills, and that students are starting to take the PSAT as early as 8th grade.
Correct.
So if you're taking the PSAT in 8th or 9th or 10th or a mixture of multiple grade levels, then by the time you're reaching 11th grade to take the SAT, you've had that ample opportunity, and hopefully that collective vertical conversation is really lending itself on the teacher side to then translating to the students, to student success on the other end. So, Jeannie, you had mentioned, you know, maybe that there's the idea of identifying anchor standards or power standards, which kind of gets at number 4 here. So you might collectively determine which ones do we want to prioritize, and comparing those prioritized selections with the SAT data. And seeing, okay, so, you know, in 8th grade, what needs to really be prioritized, and in 9th to prepare them, and are there gaps there? Are there things that are being omitted? Are we, you know?
And I know in the state of Illinois, and more also in Michigan too, is they're having PLC conversations around this.
Oh, that's
so great conversation to have with, you know, a mix of subject areas. So that way then the other subject areas are not just bored down with other standards, but they're talking about the SAT that all students will eventually take, right? So, anyways,
yeah, having that in a PLC context would be really fantastic as well. Then the College Board has also made some recommendations, so looking slightly more granularly within your classroom, having practice tests, letting students review those scores, setting some attainable goals so the students can decide what are their benchmarks, what do they want what goals are they trying to reach, and then creating some targeted practice opportunities, you know, from a formative task perspective, and students can review their progress, take ownership over time, so it's not just like, oh yeah, at some point in 11th grade, I'm going to take the SAT. I don't know what that's about. Then the hope is to take some of the mystery out of the assessment process for them, so that they're prepared, that they're seeing that they're doing some of that goal setting, you know, preliminarily as they build those skills, as they build that knowledge, so that it's not a surprise. I think that even, you know, I think as the College Board has looked back from what it seems like their tone is that it maybe had more of that mysterious feel before of like, almost like what you don't know, it's going to be on it, you don't know the context of the questions, and to have a greater sense of the types of questions, the type of expectations that are going to be set. Because just like you don't want the students to be, surprised, you as a teacher don't want to be that way either, where, oh yeah, suddenly I'm teaching 11th graders, what do they have to know for that SAT? That it's already really integrated into what you're doing.
A lot of times too, or more and more, we've found working with schools is they're having assessment conversations. And as they are creating their common assessments, they want to connect those to the specific SAT domain dimension as well as that standard piece. So within Atlas, you can do that. I don't know about other systems, but I know that that's part of the conversation in terms of building common assessments.
Absolutely.
Well, and what's interesting, too, is to see the shift where it's not about test prep. It's about meaningful instruction for these very targeted content and skills. And it's interesting to see the way that by documenting your curriculum, you have an opportunity to really drill into those very specific content and skills and have those important conversations as a grade level team, as, a vertical team, from middle school to high school. Like, are we having those conversations of how we are really supporting students to what really is, again, meaningful assessment? So,
yes, absolutely. So we also want to talk a little bit about resources. After you've had a chance to digest more of this webinar content, some of the places that you can go. So gaining access to your SAT results, that will be a critical piece, or PSAT results. From our understanding, administrators get privileges to have online access to SAT results, and then it is at their discretion to share those results with teachers. So our hope and encouragement would be, if you're an administrator listening, share those results, and if you're a teacher, then, kind of prompt your administrator that you'd like to see those SAT results to see how your students are faring. Also looking at the data from the teacher implementation guide walks you through more closely at some of the key changes, how the questions have shifted, ways to amply prepare your students, and like we've said many times, but that will hopefully closely align to what you're doing already.
Absolutely, and talking about test data, and I know we're on the hour, or on the half hour,
yes.
So we got to wrap up here, is oftentimes when we receive the data, it's not just something that we should consider right within our grade level. So again, being able to search your curriculum, your units of instruction, or maybe that area that may be strengthened, not only in your grade level, but in maybe the grade level prior to you.
Right.
So you could search that and see where specifically do we hit upon, when do we introduce, when do we drill down, the whole 9 yards. So.
Exactly, yeah, really that's where the vertical conversation piece really comes into play, working with a vertical team, reviewing your maps, and seeing, what activities and assignments do we need to provide to help students progress from grade to grade. So if you can see some of those reports on those SAT results, then that can also help you kind of work backwards to see what are some of those gaps and overlaps. So as we're preparing students.
I know it's that time, but I was sharing a story of just working with a school in Michigan. I predominantly support Michigan schools. We had K through 12 teachers together 3 weeks ago, and they were looking, it was the first time, by the way, I was so excited for them, and we had ELA teachers sharing how they approach their design and alignment to make sure there's consistency. And one of the things they notice is that within 5th grade, they approach it where there's writing, there's spelling, and then there is reading. So whereas in 6th grade, it's all combined into one, right? Well, one of the things they saw is that critical thinking skills wasn't really written into the curriculum in 5th grade, even though the teachers are like, but we do it.
The assumed curriculum.
Yeah. So it was really good for them to say, well, our 6th graders are coming in saying we were not taught that. So they actually wrote in, and they were able to agree upon common language and have a definition of what does that look like in 5th grade or 4th grade versus 6th or 7th. So we talked about 8, 9, 10 for SAT, but really it could stream down, what's it called, downstream? And
Trickle
earlier.
Yeah. Well, but what's interesting about that is, again, the work that 5th grade team was probably very good, but if they're not being implicit about the language, that how they're talking about critical thinking, that means even if the students are doing activities that are tapping into critical thinking, the students aren't aware that that's what they're doing. And if they're not, then they can't use that and leverage that as they move into 6th grade, into their prior learning. So again, just being intentional is so important. Very cool.
So that last one there is a link that Amber popped that in there, right?
So using scores and reporting to inform instruction, that link is in the chat area. So if that's something that would be helpful for you, make sure you tap into that.
Absolutely.
Well, Sarah and Jeannie, thank you.
Absolutely.
Again, as for any of you, we are so interested in getting examples of how schools are implementing these domains into their unit plans or just into their process. So if that's something you would be willing to share, we would love for you to reach out to us. And I'll just say our email is pd@rubicon.com. I'm putting that into the chat area too. Any final kind of comments you'd want to share?
Now, will they receive a copy of this recording as well?
Yes, I'm typing and thinking, and I can't do both. So for everybody who's registered, you will all be getting a recording of this webinar in your inbox in about 24 hours, so you can feel free to review that, send it to colleagues to share. We will also be putting together a written blog to kind of give a framework, or an overview of some of the key points that were made in the presentation, and we will have a recording of the presentation there too.
Yes, and that will be available in the coming weeks. So
perfect.
Another place to access that content and those resources.
And then if anybody does need a certificate of attendance, shoot me an email at pd@rubicon.com for a certificate of attendance, and I can make sure you receive that.
Fantastic. And lastly, we just want to let you know you're not in this alone.
No, so true.
We want to definitely help partner. If we could be your thought partner through the whole process, please reach out to us, email, call us, and note that we come to the table with a listening ear as well as some samples for you and your team.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, ladies, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for participating today.
Absolutely. And Ann, I just saw your note to send a copy. That will automatically come through your email. So look for that in about 24 hours, and you will get that. So thank you, ladies. Thank you all for joining us. And on that note, we will sign off and move on.
That's right. Enjoy the rest of the day.
All right.
Thank you.